On June 22, 2025, the United States executed Operation Midnight Hammer, where over 125 U.S. military aircraft targeted 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan.
Tonight I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
The complex, high-risk strikes followed a stunning surprise attack by the Israelis that targeted Iran's key nuclear sites, air defenses, missile sites, military leaders, and nuclear scientists. It was an exquisite military and intelligence operation years in the making. Iran responded with salvos of missile and drone strikes against Israel and against a U.S. airbase in Qatar. A fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran is currently holding. Discussions are underway on potential nuclear negotiations between Iranian and U.S. officials, and much of Washington has been gripped with questions about the effectiveness of the U.S. strikes, the degree to which Iran's nuclear program has been set back, and what comes next. I'm Kari Bingen, Director of the Aerospace Security Project here at CSIS. Here to unpack these questions, I'm joined today by Heather Williams, Director of the Project on Nuclear Issues, and Tom Karako, Director of the Missile Defense Project. We will take audience questions, so please submit those via the homepage. Heather, great to see you and Tom again. I'm going to start with you because I think there's a baseline of education that needs to happen here. It's useful to talk through the key elements of a nuclear weapons program and weaponization versus or including what the nuclear fuel cycle is. And I think that will help to explain the significance of what was struck and why different pieces were struck. So can you talk us through those pieces first?
Absolutely, because the short answer of what was struck is it was Iran's nuclear program that was struck, but what is an actual nuclear program? And so I think that we can start with this slide you can see here. I'll move my head so you can see different parts of it. The different steps of the nuclear fuel cycle, and I'll go through this quickly because these align with the Iranian facilities that were targeted. And what you're trying to get after in this fuel cycle is uranium-235, which is fissionable. It's the fissile material that you can use for fuel, also what you could use in a nuclear weapon. The first real phases I want to focus on here are the mining and milling, because uranium actually is a naturally occurring very heavy metal, but it's in rocks, it's in soil, and so you have to have this mining process to get it out. And so then it goes through this chemical adaptation process and it's turned into yellow cake, which is more of a powder. It's a powderous uranium oxide. It's not always yellow, fun little fact. Sometimes it's black apparently. But once you have that yellow cake, then you're going to move on to the next step, which is conversion. And conversion is what the Isfahan site was. At conversion is when it is converted from yellow cake from the yellow cake powder into a uranium hexafluoride gaseous form. And Isfahan was obviously a really central component of that. Once you have that gaseous form of it, then you move on to the enrichment phase where you're trying to increase the amount or the percentage of uranium-235 that is within that gas that you have. And when you start enriching it, it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's getting more rich in that uranium-235, which you can then use for civilian purposes and fuel fabrication, power generation. For civilian purposes, though, you really don't need over 10% enrichment, and even that's pretty high, to be honest. The previous Iran nuclear deal limited Iran to between 3 and 4% enrichment rate. And when the Israelis attacked, the International Atomic Energy Agency had just come out and acknowledged Iran had been enriching to 60%, which is really high. Like, it's really hard to understand a civilian justification for that amount. But also the IAEA had found higher enrichment amounts in places that they really should not have been. And so just quickly going back to that chart, then the enrichment point, that's the other two really important sites that were hit, Natanz and Fordo. And Natanz was the biggest enrichment site, whereas Fordo was a little bit smaller, but Fordo, as I'm sure everyone now knows, was deeply buried underneath a mountain near Qom. And so we can do a quick little look at some of the satellite imagery that we have. This is the before picture of Fordo. And so on here, you can see different structures, you can see different tunnels. and some above ground facilities going on here as well. This is an image from just a few days before the U.S. strike. And what you see here are those cargo trucks. And President Trump has referred to these. Numerous people have pointed to these and said, was this the Iranians taking that enriched uranium, that gaseous form, which would have been in these canisters, and enriched to 60%, and moving that out? What we believe is that they were actually there to try to block the tunnels, putting in concrete, soil, trying to protect the site so that some part of it might survive. But the last satellite image I'll put up is this is the after effects on the site. And so again, you can see the level of damage here. Things literally just flattened. And so there are a lot of competing intel reports coming out, and I want to get to those. But just very quickly, I do want to do a quick stock take of what is the status, to the best of our knowledge, about Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan right now. So at Fordo, it has been reported there is major damage. I would point out that just because an underground facility hasn't collapsed doesn't mean that it's operational. Like that doesn't mean that those centrifuges are still spinning. Centrifuges are really sensitive. They can spin out of control. And so what is going on at Fordo, we won't know until somebody tries to get in there. However, we know that major damage was done. At Isfahan, there were above ground sites that were completely destroyed. Even before the U.S. strikes, IAEA Director General Grossi said that Natanz, that the enrichment there had been destroyed because of a power cut. So again, these centrifuges are sensitive. If you cut the power to them, they spin out of control and are inoperable. And then that last site that we've all focused on was the conversion facility at Isfahan. Again, it is believed that the uranium processing there was also destroyed, significant damage to the underground. The last point I'll make on this about Isfahan is that is where the 60% enrichment materials believed to have been stockpiled. There was a 400 kilogram stockpile that Iran had, and there seem to be a lot of questions about where that is, but that's just one of a lot of questions about the status of the damage and the damage assessment. And this is where I think the intel community has gotten a little bit caught up, and there's some competing intel reports going on about what actually happened.
Well, and it doesn't surprise me that this early on that there are competing intelligence reports, and I would just note, and I would urge caution as these individual reports come out. The DAA report that has been referenced publicly, I imagine that senior policymakers were asking, once the strikes happen, what do we know? And so you're asking analysts based on whatever information that they can get their hands on in various channels, whether it be technical information, satellite imagery, human sources, maybe information from our allies and partners. Each intelligence agency is receiving different sources of information. It will take them time to collate all that, collect all of it, analyze it, and then that's why you have a National Intelligence Council, right? To pull it all together to figure out what do we know, what do we still not know. And so I would just urge caution as we see those reports come to light. Tom, all of this now begs the question of what are we trying to accomplish with these strikes against Iran's nuclear program? What is the strategic significance of the strikes? Do you sense that there is a different set of objectives that perhaps the U.S. has pursued versus Israel? What's your take?
Yeah, I think the context goes a very long way here, and I do think there's almost certainly different perspectives on what the goals are. I mean, look, there's a question, would the United States have done this if Israel had not launched this attack? October 7 changed Israel's posture to all of their neighbors and to all of their adversaries in the region. And they said, never again, we're going to have a bold counteroffensive. There will always be uncertainty about all this stuff. And boldness, courage is acting in the face of that uncertainty. I think this was the right thing to do. I think there is, of course, uncertainty. And I think some of that can potentially be mitigated if one does not assume that this is just a one-off. Now, it may be that from the U.S. perspective, there is a desire to just be one and done, to fly home, have a parade, and leave it over to the Israelis to deal with whatever's left. But as I think, frankly, our colleague Emily Harding wrote in the Washington Post recently, look, if we didn't get everything, if there's more to be done, then fly back. Those B-2s can fly back and hit it again. So I think if there is, just staying on the nuclear program, for instance, if there's something else that we figure out from sifting the intel, why not go back again to finish the job? But I think also it's not just about the nuclear program. That's a massively important thing. I think from my perspective, and I think certainly from the Israeli perspective, and frankly other folks in the region, the conventional missile forces and all the pieces of the kill chain that go into their missile forces. I think the IDF said last weekend they probably have about 1,500 missiles left and like 200 launchers. Well, if you live in the region, that matters to you. You know, they popped off a handful of them at our Al Udeid base in Qatar this week, for instance. So I think those goals matter just a whole lot. But I want to say one other thing, and that is, I think President Trump tweeted some version of this, that American hardware was put on display as it's just being really good. And that has a signaling value. It has, frankly, a deterrent value to our friends in North Korea. I mean, I can't listen to Raising Cane, Chairman Kane, talk about the fact that we had the world's best nerds spending 15 years, PhDs, just to figure out how to target Fordo. If you're in Pyongyang or you're in Moscow or Beijing, you're like, man, what kind of teams of PhDs do they have working on our sites? So I think there's a lot of utility there, in addition to just the bottom line takeaway of sometimes you got to give strength a chance, and strength can be potential and it can be kinetic, and in this case it was kinetic.
Well, and going back to the significance of this, Heather, you outlined the nuclear fuel cycle. So what is the significance of the damage and the targeting that was done? Does this remove Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon?
I'm going to take your advice and practice caution in saying that until there are more comprehensive intel assessments going out. However, I ran through very quickly what was the damage in pretty broad terms. Yeah. But let's be clear. The Iranian nuclear program has been significantly set back. Okay. I wouldn't want to venture a guess in terms of breakout timelines, because it depends on do they have, so they had, the day before the Israeli strikes, they said that they had a third enrichment site. Mm-hmm. We don't know where that is for sure. We don't know how many cascades do they have there, how much could they enrich, how fast could they enrich it. We don't know what has happened to that stockpile, which we absolutely need to find out. So in terms of the timeline and that part of the assessment, it's really going to depend on all these factors that I'm not even going to dare venture a guess on, because it's so dependent on that. But I really do want to piggyback on something Tom said, which is there is a lot of success in this story. The Iranian nuclear program right now is a shadow of its former self. And to be clear, this was a nuclear program that was there for nefarious purposes. I think the timing of the Israeli strikes on June 12th, 13th is really important. Those strikes came right after an IAEA Board of Governors report that found Iran was in breach of its non-proliferation commitments for the first time in 20 years. The IAEA, like all international organizations, has a lot of politics going on in it. For them to come to that conclusion was a really big step, I think. But also it came on the heels of a 60-day deadline that President Trump had set for the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks. It also came on the heels of Iran saying, oh, by the way, we're in breach of this IAEA report. We also have a third enrichment site. Yes, we'll open it up for you to come in. But the timing of the Israeli strikes, it was not arbitrary, and that's just from the nuclear perspective. Mm-hmm. I'm sure we can also get into the status of Hezbollah and Hamas during the timing of those strikes. But it is all to say, if Israel's objective, if Operation Midnight Hammer's objective was to significantly damage and set back the Iranian nuclear program, I think that it did a pretty decent job by what we know thus far.
Well, and on Israel, I had the opportunity to travel to Israel at the end of 2024, engage in a wide variety of conversations, and one of my key takeaways was Israel's assessment of who was really behind October 7th. And they went back through, culled their information sources, and realized that the theory of victory had changed for Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, where those three parties all thought that they could generate a multi-front attack on Israel and really deal it, I'll say, a death blow. So October 7th, all roads for Israel lead back to Tehran. So in my mind, it doesn't surprise me that they've gone as heavy as they have against Iran, but they could only go so far, and that's where the U.S. Operation Midnight Hammer really came into play, because we only have those MOPS, which I know, Tom, you want to talk about. But the other thing I would say, and myself and our colleague Clayton Swope wrote a commentary on this yesterday, is there was a unique window right now with Israel, or with Iran's air defenses in shambles, its military command and control in disarray, its proxies on their heels. The IAE reports that you mentioned, where the threat was growing. There was a unique window for the U.S. to conduct this operation now that may close as Iran seeks to replenish its air defenses and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But let's talk the Operation Midnight Hammer, because I know, Tom, you want to talk MOP, and Heather, you want to talk a little bit more about just the operational complexity underway.
Well, first of all, I think one of the word that you used, Heather, in terms of saying uncertainty about what they may be able to do, given the perhaps uncertainty of the damage, I think the operative word in that sentence for me is the they, which is, and Kari, to your point, post-October 7, Israel changed its posture, and they went after the leadership. They just went after Hezbollah, in some amazingly well-coordinated attacks. Did the same thing with the IRGC and Air Force leadership, getting them all in a room and then blowing up the room. The fact that Hezbollah told Iran like a week ago, hey guys, we know you've been supporting us for the past couple of decades, but we're going to sit this one out. Syria. Bashar Assad is gone. The Hezbollah leadership is massively changed, and Netanyahu said, I think over the last weekend, that they want a regime change in Iran. So that's the they here. There's the they that are nuclear scientists, most of whom are dead. That goes a long way to the brains beyond how to spin the centrifuges, but also the they. And I can't help but think that there may be a difference of objectives here between the United States. Trump calling for a ceasefire might actually kind of throw the Iranian regime a lifeline when it needs it most, when they're back on their heels the most. And so I think there's more to come here, that it's not just a one and done, because as you said, Kari, all roads lead to Tehran in their theory of how they got to October 7 in the first place.
Yeah. Heather, talk about Operation Midnight Hammer.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that General Kane's statements were not hyperbole in expressing just how complicated of a mission this was. Just the OPSEC alone, and trying to keep all of this information to a close hold, very small number of people. But then if you think about what these B2s actually, what the B2s and the B2 pilots, quite frankly, actually did. And so they're carrying, so we know that there were 14 strikes, 7 planes, I would assume 2 bombs per plane. So that's 2 30,000-pound bombs on each one of these planes, and then 7 of them flying in formation. And you also had the decoy that had been sent as well. And so you have them flying in formation, assumedly at night, probably some weather going on, and that's going to require multiple refuelings. Yeah. And so you're doing these refuelings. Also, if you have OPSEC, you might not be having a ton of comms going on while you're doing this. Mm-hmm. And so it truly is an awesome mission that that I think they executed. And again, we'll have to wait and see what the official battle damage assessments are. But I don't want to lose sight of just how impressive of mission this really was, and it truly is somewhat awe-inspiring when you see what the U.S. military can do when it really puts its mind to it. Just one additional point I want to add on to the conversation about the damage assessments, because I think that is going to be an ongoing conversation. Mm-hmm. The best way to really get a battle damage assessment, to get a full understanding of what Iran might do next and where this might go, it is to get IAEA inspectors back on the ground, to be honest. They know better than anybody, what should I be looking for? What did this look like beforehand? Rafael Grossi has been to Fordo. And to get them back in there, and thus far Iran has said that they are not interested in letting IAEA inspectors back in. This might require a little bit of time. But I think that is going to be one really big indicator of Iran's intentions following this operation.
Well, that's exactly a question from the audience here, is how do you see the U.S. attack as impacting the IAEA's activities in Iran, as well as, given Pony's emphasis on strategic stability and non-proliferation, how concerned are you about the ramifications for the nuclear non-proliferation treaty?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the IAEA question because I think it's a really good one. What it means for the IAEA's mission, that's up to Iran. It's up to Iran whether or not they want to return to their pre-existing relationship with the IAEA and let the IAEA inspectors back in and come back into full compliance with their non-proliferation obligations. And so I really see that one as being in Tehran's court. From what I know of the IAEA and Director General Grossi, that agency is really pure of heart, and they really want to do the right thing and do their job. And so I would imagine that once it's safe for them to go in, they would want to do just that. In terms of the impact on the non-proliferation treaty, I really appreciate this question. So right after the Israeli strikes, the Iranian parliament supposedly drafted a bill for Iran to withdraw from the NPT. There have been some subsequent discussions, I understand, in their parliament that might suggest that they will go ahead with that. We haven't seen that happen yet. So I don't want to be too alarmist about the NPT, but for me, the American and Israeli decision to strike is a pretty damning assessment about the health of the NPT. If you no longer think that the international nuclear order and that norms are going to be able to restrain a country like Iran, to me, that's a red flag that maybe we need to find other ways to strengthen this order and to strengthen these norms to hold them compliant. The IAEA Board of Governors report that found Iran in noncompliance, that didn't happen overnight. That didn't come out of nowhere. And so I am really grateful that people are thinking about what this all means for the international nuclear order, because that's going to have to be a multilateral effort to step in. I would just say, in the NPT community, I think I made this comment on a previous one of our discussions, everyone always says, this NPT review conference is the most important one ever. And it's, NPT geeks we get excited about this. The next RevCon is going to be in spring 2026. This is going to be a really, really hard one. We haven't had consensus in the NPT for two past review conferences, and this isn't just dealing with the status of the Iranian program, it's also dealing with the ongoing strikes on Ukrainian reactors and Russia's ongoing nuclear threats. So all to say, I'm pretty worried about the health of the nuclear order right now.
Can I jump in here? Yeah. Which is, first of all, on Operation Midnight Hammer, somebody in the Pentagon needs to get a medal for naming that. It's just too cool to not highlight and say that out loud. And second, I didn't really answer your question about the MOPS, which is that in addition to the signal to our adversaries that, hey, we got teams of folks in the basement studying this stuff, look, this was a weapon that was designed for this kind of a mission, and it appears to have done at least a pretty decent job. The biggest non-nuclear weapon in our arsenal, and so that's pretty impressive. I mean, I'm sitting here looking at the videos of this sort of thing, and I'm thinking Johnny Cash, Ring of Fire. I went down, and the flames crept higher. It's impressive, and again, our adversaries have to see that, both in terms of what we're signaling and even if it's imperfect, the kinetic results.
If I can just quickly jump in on this, because I think that as a counter-proliferation tool, this is Tom is 100% right. This is a really powerful message.
Counter versus non-pro.
Yes, counter-proliferation, which is to say, if you start down this path, let's be clear, you will be held accountable by somebody and you will be stopped. I also just want to provide context from a different theater, which was the Ukrainians also recently launched a counter-proliferation strike at the opposite end of the sophistication spectrum, perhaps, of using these drones to take out a non-insignificant portion of Russia's strategic bomber force. And so those two events happening pretty close together is a really fascinating trend.
Well, in their Operation Rising Lion, which set the stage for this, also went after various nuclear targets as well, using drones and missiles.
Yeah.
Okay, Tom, that leads me to an air and missile defense question, which we can't escape here. But from the audience, the question is, Iran's ability to launch missile and drone retaliation within hours seems to indicate a robust asymmetric deterrent. How does that challenge current U.S. and Israeli missile defense doctrine, especially under these real-time saturation scenarios? So talk about air and missile defense, maybe the status of the inventories on all sides.
Well, a couple things there. One, on the Iranian air defense side, I mean, look, it was some mix of cyber and non-kinetic and, yes, just strike operations that very impressively suppressed Iranian air defenses, those that were left, in a very short period of time. The fact that Israeli, probably third-generation aircraft are flying around the country, bombing with impunity with gravity bombs, just about anything they want. That's super impressive. And so if you're on their side, you have just lost all of your air defenses. Conversely, on the side of the Israelis and the United States, our air missile defenses are doing pretty good. They're doing pretty well, and in fact, they're doing very well. So there have been, I think, 400 Iranian missiles in the first over the weekend, basically in response, which also communicates to you that missile defeat is hard, that scud hunting is hard, that the Israelis, despite all of their many successes, were not able to preclude those hundreds of missiles coming in. So that's a quick reminder of why we have to have passive and active defense, because you're not going to get, it's just never going to happen. The hiders are going to outwit the finders on the scud hunting piece time and time again. And then on the capacity thing, look, there's lots of really cool videos of the Israeli missile defenses and the THAADs. According to some press reports, the United States may have expended like several years worth of THAAD interceptor procurement over the course of the weekend. And you know what? In the budget docs that came out, I think yesterday, you see the objective ordnance numbers, say for the U.S. Army for PAC-3 emissaries, they're going to quadruple. Okay, this is, everybody's kind of, I would say, panicked, and they're kind of realizing, oops, we really do need lots and lots of missile defenses. You see their capability in spades. I mean, look, if there's any hit-to-kill deniers out there, I don't see how you have that after first the defense of Israel, and then likewise the soldiers, the air defenders, who the chairman called out rightly so in his remarks.
To see.
The 20-somethings who were defending the base, and doing so, you know, with an exceptionally high batting average in the highest and in the largest single Patriot engagement in history, apparently.
No, that's a really great point to have one General Kane call out just the tremendous capabilities and the vigilance of those air defenders. But to your point, Tom, I mean, we have a budget with details starting to come out. We will need more of these air and missile defense interceptors capabilities. And oh, by the way, we just expended many MOPS, and I don't think that there was many left there as well. So, you know, there are additional capabilities that we'll have to pursue. We are running out of time, so let me finish. I know there's a lot of great questions here. Let me finish with a question on what comes next. So I'm going to integrate a question here from the audience, which is, you know, at this point, do you see options for de-escalation and or future negotiations? But what comes next? What are the longer term ramifications here, including looking at the power dynamics in the Middle East writ large?
I'll start on the diplomacy side and the prospects for talks. I mean, it seems like the Iranians they gave themselves an off-ramp, I think, in the way that they conducted the strike, that they, it provided them a face-saving option and a narrative to provide to their domestic audiences. And so there might be some incentives there to return to the negotiating table. You know, I suspect the Iranians and the Americans will again sit down and talk about the status of Iran's nuclear program. I wouldn't put a bet on when that will be. When it happens, the same two problems that existed before these strikes are going to endure. And problem number one might be resolvable. Problem number one is about enrichment. Iran insists on its right to enrich, which it technically does have under the NPT. However, you only have that right to enrich as long as you are not using it for weapons purposes. And this is why Iran was found to be in breach. I suspect Iran will continue to insist on their right to some sort of enrichment, and the U.S. will even more forcefully now insist on zero enrichment. There might be some creative solutions for this, like an enrichment consortium in the region. Perhaps another country can supply some fuel. The thing is, it's a very, very small percentage of Iran's nuclear power that actually comes from nuclear. And so it's kind of curious why they are so committed to this, if not for some sort of a weapons future program. But the second problem that I think is going to be the bigger one is Israel. Israel has never liked these talks. They have never wanted these talks to happen. And I struggle to see why their position on that would change after this. And so I would say, you know, I think a return to dialogue at some point will probably happen. Whether or not it has a better outcome than the previous dialogues, I'm a little bit skeptical.
Well, so were these strikes a deterrent message to other countries, or do you think they race for the bomb?
I'm not gonna make a bet on that one. I can see arguments on both sides. I think it really depends on what happens domestically within Iran itself now and what happens with hardliners. I've seen a lot of predictions, and I'm not an expert on Iranian domestic politics, but I've seen a lot of folks saying this is just going to incentivize and empower the hardliners. I would also point out the Ayatollah is not young and was silent for the majority of this for personal safety reasons that I understand. But on the Iranian side, I can understand if there is this hawkish incentive to race to a bomb. But I would point out it's going to be really, really hard for them to do that, given the damage that that we believe has been inflicted upon them. I also think they might need a little bit of help if they want to race to a bomb. For example, getting more centrifuges. We don't know how advanced their weaponization technology was, which is actually just taking that enriched material, converting it into an actual explosive device and bomb, getting trigger devices right, and then mounting it on a delivery vehicle. And Iran doesn't really have many nuclear technical experts around anymore to help them do that. And so even if they do want to race to a bomb, it's going to look very different and be a whole lot harder for them than it would have been beforehand. But I think that is ultimately a question that's really up to the Iranians.
And that's why I think your distinction between norms and non-proliferation versus counterpro, kinetic counterproliferation, I think you're exactly right as well, that dialogues, it's not going to change their disposition broadly. And that's why I think that it might play into their hands. It may be kind of a continuity between U.S. perceived goals and the Iranians' goals in terms of status quo, but I can't think that the Israelis especially are going to be satisfied with that. And that's why I think that in terms of arms control, as is sometimes said of gun control, the best approach is a wide stance and a firm grip. And I think that looking for the ways to essentially either offer the current Iranian regime an offer they can't refuse, or otherwise just continuing to degrade and pound away, because I don't think you're going to change their disposition or their true willingness to change.
Yeah, and Iran is we can't neglect right now that Iran is in such a vulnerable position. It is not in their interest to start a wider war in the Middle East. So on escalation, in many respects, I anticipated a more measured response after Operation Midnight Hammer. And what we saw with their strikes against Al Udeid, it was very much a play from the playbook in January 2020. After the United States took out Qasem Soleimani, they struck back at al-Assad. I'll say, the key in the part of the story there is, one, is we have a tremendous intelligence community. So I think the intelligence there was very strong. We had space assets like our missile warning assets that were able to detect those missile launches and create a couple of minutes of window for our forces to be able to duck and cover. So I see that similar thing happen here with Al Udeid. I think where this could have gone haywire, and fortunately it didn't, is if any U.S. Service members, civilians, were killed as a result of the strikes on Al Udeid, or if Iran looked at the nuclear strikes as we must strike back even more, whether it be the assassinations or other things. So I think there's still an open question on that, but they don't want a wider war right now.
I think the other open question that could be a game changer here is the role of Russia. We know that the Iranian foreign minister went to Moscow, I believe it was on Monday. We can probably guess what the ask was, and it seems it's apparent what the answer was. And so if I were the Iranians right now, I'd be saying, what is the point of that strategic partnership deal that I signed with you? Yeah. And Russia obviously has other things going on and is a little bit distracted and doesn't have many munitions to spare or share. But if that changes and Moscow does decide to take a more collective defense approach to its relationship with Iran, or to be more supportive of Iran, I think that could potentially embolden them, and that could lead to wider escalation risks.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, Tom, to your points early on, is the door is now open to negotiations, but we are negotiating from a position of strength.
I just don't want to close the door to an outcome that has Khamenei hanging out in Moscow with Bashar Assad and Ed Snowden. I mean, that could be a good outcome here too.
That's a great point. Well, there is so much more to track in the weeks and months ahead. So much more to unpack here that we didn't get time for. But Heather, Tom, and I will be back here in the seats to have more discussions on timely issues. So everyone in the audience, thank you for tuning in to this discussion today. Thank you to the CSIS streaming and broadcasting team. Stay tuned for more joint discussions between the CSIS Missile Defense Project, Project on Nuclear Issues, and the Aerospace team.